teaching and learning. This talk will be delivered by Prof. Dr. Aiman Nariman from Ahmad Ibrahim Kuliah of Laws, ICOL. As educators, administrators, and influence next generation, we bear significant responsibilities. We are entrusted with exemplifying the highest standards of ethical behavior. These principles not only form the foundation of these universities, but are also crucial in shaping the intellectual development and future prospects of our students. By incorporating the principles of anti-bribery management system into our daily operations, we ensure the continued cultivation of a culture characterized by honesty and accountability across all levels of teaching and learning. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to inform you that our university obtained the ISO 37001-2016 ABMS certification on 27 March 2024. This achievement represents a significant milestone in our ongoing commitment to upholding the highest standards of integrity, transparency, and ethical governance within our institution. So, what is ABMS? ABMS is a management system designed to assist organizations in preventing, detecting, and responding to bribery. It provides a framework for establishing, implementing, maintaining, and improving anti-bribery policies, procedures, and controls. The objective is to mitigate the risk of bribery within the organization and ensure compliance with legal and regulatory requirements. Currently, a few KCDIOMs have been selected for participation in the ISO 37001-2016 ABMS initiative held in March 2024. Therefore, the university aims to include all kuliah in the ABMS audit by 2025. With that, the ABMS committee also offers an opportunity and engagement to discuss the challenges in implementing ABMS at KCDIOMs. Throughout this session, we encourage active participation, discussion, and an exchange of ideas. Your perspective, experience, and insights are invaluable as we collectively strive to promote a culture of transparency, integrity, and compliance within our organization and across industry. Without further ado, may I respectfully invite Prof. Dr. Aiman Nariman to deliver her talk on the implementation of ABMS in teaching and learning. Please welcome Prof.
Assalamualaikum and good morning, brothers and sisters, fellow educators and respected administrators, physically here as well as joining us virtually. Welcome to like the MC was saying, a sharing session where I hope we could all join hands in fostering a climate or environment where corrupt practices could be minimized, if not eradicated. Let's start with looking at one of the earlier reports by the UNESCO, International Education Planning branch of UNESCO, where they produced a report in 2007 highlighting the prevalence, if I can say, of corrupt practices in the education sector. The title of the report is Corrupt Schools, Corrupt Universities, What Can Be Done? Not long after that, I suppose a decade later, another document was released focusing on the higher education sector specifically. These are all available. If you're interested, you could go look at it for yourself. But for the purpose of our sharing session, it's interesting to note that these two documents actually laid out what are corruption risk, opportunities, if I can use the word, where corrupt practices in the education sector, both at the school level and at the university level, has flourished. and what are steps that could be taken to minimize this opportunity risk, both at the institutional level and both at the individual level. I'll be sharing with you some of the information later as we proceed with the sharing session. Yeah. Now, if you look at the report, both reports in 2007 and 2016, the recommendations recognize, right, that there is this thing called unethical teaching practices, educational practices. If you look at the title and you look at the role of education sector, you realize that there seems to be a contradiction in terms, in the sense that we're hoping that education will create a generation where there is trustworthiness, questions of integrity becomes the norm rather than the exception, issues about corruption is minimized. And so the report identifies possibilities where the education sector itself could be corrupted. But it's also interesting to see that there is a view that just looking at the education sector alone is not enough, right? We need to look also at the ethical education. When you look at ethics and education, we're trying to create an environment through courses, through training activities, where we want to embed integrity principle, awareness of integrity practices, for example, into the course syllabus. But not much attention seems to be given to how ethical is the way that we deliver the services that we are supposed to give to our stakeholders. So I thought as a starting, hopefully for more sessions in the future, we could look at what are our roles. What are the roles that we should be playing in terms of making sure that what we provide is ethical education, as opposed to looking only at ethics component in the courses that we provide to our students. I'm not saying that ethics education is not important, right? Because part of the problem that we face is supposedly lack of awareness, right? But I suppose when we talk about teaching and learning, the three components involved in teaching and learning, the delivery component, which is what we as educators are supposed to do, what we want our students to acquire at the end of the session, the students' responsibility in terms of the learning component, right? What do they acquire at the end of session, and also the assessment component. So I think it's very important for us to consider and perhaps shift the focus away from looking at what bad behaviors within the student body, but perhaps be truthful and look at what we could have done to make sure that we are also responsible in the delivery of our courses, right? So if we have that in mind, perhaps we can focus on that, and that's why I thought we'll be looking at more on the responsibility of educators and administrators. Next. So if we look at Malaysia, right, there is an education blueprint. If I recall, 2013 to 2025. It talks about how students should be provided with quality education, but no specific mention is used in relation to corruption, right? Perhaps because the focus was you're looking at improving the content, the delivery system. And so in 2019, we have actually two, an ACP, 2019 and 2023. The next one, please. 2024 to 2028. Right? Can we go back to the previous slide? All right. So the strategy, I think, which is relevant to us, is strategy 2.42 and 2.44. First, focusing on lecturers, induction training in terms of awareness building, right? And 2.44 talks about the role of educators. So here you see a mix of institutional reform, institutional recommendation and changes, and also at the individual level, right? 2024 now, 2025 is coming soon. Next slide, please. Right. The strategy that would be relevant would be number 7. Is it possible to zoom? Or perhaps maybe you can look at it later on. Strategy number 7. Right? And you will see, I have to move around a bit. You will see the Ministry of Higher Education is relevant for strategy 6 and 7. Right? So our discussion is about corruption in the higher education sector and how do we prevent that in the teaching and learning activities. So if you look at this document, there are some suggestions on courses, ethics course, at the different category of the tertiary education sector. Next slide. There are other strategies as well, but again, it follows the proposition that we are looking at inculcating ethics course in the education system. I suppose just reading the documents, you won't really be able to see, right? How do we inculcate those ethical education factors into our teaching and learning system? Okay, so perhaps we can focus on that more. And next slide. The problem with creating ethical education, making sure that there is ethical education in the way we deliver our services to our students, is that the devil is always in the details, right? And the issue sometimes is because of perhaps lack of clarity in terms of the rules and principles. So I think without us looking at corrupt practices, without considering what are the hurdles to effective implementation, it could be a futile exercise, right? So these are some of the often highlighted reasons why anti-corruption practices or policies are not able to be well implemented, not just in the education sector, but in other sectors as well, right? Please be mindful of the fact that there are other issues like procurement, right, which do not only afflict the education sector. So perhaps we can have that as a different discussion, but for the time being, we are looking at the teaching and learning activities. So some of the issues that have been raised as a reason why there is unethical education practices as opposed to ethics in education. One often relied on example or reason, quite simplistic reason actually, is the deference to cultural norms, right? Take for example, issue of gifts. And we sometimes think that some culture, gift giving is to build rapport. Okay, you deal with relationship investing. So you provide gifts as token of appreciation. Now, relying on culture alone, okay, it will not be useful. We are taking note of the fact that there is some important significance of culture. So when we talk about anti-corrupt policies, it must be taken in context, right? So certain activities in context of culture, but it cannot be used to its extreme. If you look at practices relying on culture, gift giving, for example, even amongst the community, there is some values attached to it. For example, you will have to evaluate, right, the value of the gift being given, the timing of the gift being given. In some society, perhaps for our activities, right, that would be the norm. But there are certain scenarios where, because of the timing of the giving of the appreciation for the gift, that it will not be justified even within certain cultural norms. Okay? There are also research showing that certain culture have different ways of learning. They work more in a collaborative manner. So there was a research that I came across saying that the students' submission from a particular country, right, from a particular geographical area, a few of them had the same way of introducing the topic when assessment is submitted for evaluation. Okay? And the reason was because they worked collaboratively. So there's a view to be sharing that there's nothing wrong with using the same ideas if you are doing this for the public good, right? But when you look at situations where the culture is used as the sole, very strong factor, okay, as a hurdle to implementing anti-corruption policies and practices, you realize that culture can be changed. And what may be good in the past may no longer be the same because of changing community expectations. So culture alone can be molded. And that's one of the issues that we need to acknowledge. We cannot be relying on culture as a reason. In fact, we should be the one framework. We have that bi'ah environment. Okay? And that's what we need to create. And it's not, the fact is that even if we have the certification already, it is always a work in progress. Because people will change, the environment will change. And so we do not look at the fact that we have a certification as the end. It's a beginning of more work to be done, right? So the second point is also the argument that there is lack of awareness. Not enough resources spent on training. Perhaps true, perhaps there is sufficient training in terms of quantity, but may not be appropriate in terms of quantity, in terms of its relevance and significance. You have cases where information are being communicated, right? And still some of the argument given is lack of awareness. Personally, I think it's not a lack of awareness. Personally, I think it's a lack of ethical mindset, which is more dangerous, right? The absence is more dangerous in the sense that we are taking the lack of integrity as something which is normal, which is acceptable. And it could lead to a situation where unethical practices becomes the norm rather than the exception. So this normalization of corrupt practices should be nipped in the bud. Lack of awareness, I think in certain institutions there has been effort given to share the information, to highlight how reporting should be done. But perhaps at our level, we need to have a different mindset. And that's where I think, sharing experience, the normalization of bad practices should be part of the community purposes, yeah, and intention. Yeah. Okay. The third would be unwillingness to change accepted practices. I think it's common. Sometimes when you have complaints about how system is done, the report that you get is, oh, it's a system's fault, right? Perhaps it's a question of unwillingness to make changes. Sometimes we have people who perhaps because of their very nature don't know, right? Why do you want to scratch things? Leave it where there's nothing broken, so don't fix it. But the problem is sometimes because of practices which is so entrenched, then we do not find that there is relevance of that practice anymore. You have sometimes situations where there is a system in place, right? And the problem is the system which is supposed to provide objectivity and standardization becomes a very strong indicator of the reluctance of the administrators to change, right? So 1, 2, 3, a lot has to do with self-education and an awareness and a willingness to make changes internally, right, at an individual level. Number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6. And these are situations where there could be problem with the institutional structure, right? You have policies which are skewed, which is not correct. Take, for example, our rule relating to attendance, right? And there have been attempts in the past, fortunately that has changed, that attendance should be part of the assessment, right? The intention is to create students who are committed, who are disciplined, who are able to meet timeline. So you give probably 5, 10 marks for students attending the class. To me, that is a skewed policy. Because if you want to create commitment to deadlines, dedication, you could do it by way of making sure students submit work on time. There are cases where students are around only in terms of a physical presence, but their role is not there. So we have to be careful as administrator whether the policies are skewed, right? Sometimes we have the assessment ranking, okay, metrics that we want to use. These are useful. Again, like I said, to provide standardization. But we can't be relying this solely for the purpose of meeting the ranking, right? So we as administrator need to look at whether the policies are appropriate. What is the value that we want to protect? What is the value that we want to suggest to be adopted? And see whether the policies needs to be amended. Weak regulatory framework is a very difficult problem to resolve, right? Because internally, we only have authority to make changes within our policy. But we could adopt some of this weak regulatory framework internally, okay, and make changes to it, to improve it in terms of perhaps providing better sanctions. In terms of anti-corrupt policies, we need to be aggressive in terms of enforcement and sanction. But in terms of awareness, you know, making sure that our colleagues are keeping up to standards of professional conduct, right? And this must be done in perhaps a more gentle manner, taking the soft approach. So we need to be able to adapt and choose what strategy that we want to implement in terms of making sure that any internal regulatory framework is addressed. There should be also changes made to laws. And I think the response that university have taken up in terms of the ABMS framework is a result of that need, that call for changes in legislation, right? Okay. Underutilization of student and stakeholder engagement. Sometimes we do not want to make use of that wealth of experience of the youthful vigor. Okay, the students' interest in making sure that they get what they are promised in terms of the delivery of the course, for example. At UI, we have the student group, right? Amar, and they have several chapters around universities in Malaysia. So that's an example of how student engagement could be used to improve the delivery system. Okay. Next one. Right. So, the more interesting part is this. Okay. Identification of corrupt practices, possible corrupt practices that could occur in the teaching and learning environment. You have a lot of report taking the time of explaining, okay, or categorizing the type of corrupt practices in terms of institutional reform, in terms of perhaps publication and research as one component. Some write-up, some research divide this based on the functions that exist in the delivery system. So there could be categorization based on research and publication, right? Based on student assessment only, based on student delivery, okay, delivery of the course materials. There are also categorization based on the influence of external parties. So there is political issues in corruption in education sector, corruption of the education sector. So perhaps you could look at the proliferation of educational institution, which may not be able to provide sufficient infrastructure, okay, because of certain patronage connection with outside parties. Okay? So just bear in mind that there's a whole range of functional corruption that could exist in the education sector. For the time being, we're looking at student-lecturer engagement and the role of educators and administrators in minimizing those corrupt practices. So like I said, the challenge is perhaps lack of awareness. And lack of awareness could be also because there is no clarity of rules and guidance and policies. Right? There's always this discussion about there's not enough rules. And we tend to think that the more rules there is, the better. But that is not necessarily the case. So perhaps you have to have an arrangement where we look at the principles and policies in place first. We look at concepts and principles and see how that can be reflected by having rules. Having more rules will not assist if you do not know or you do not understand or you're not aware of the spirit behind the rules. Right? So perhaps we can have this kind of division to identify what are the corruption risks in the delivery of our services as educators, i.e. the teaching component, the learning component, as well as the assessment component. Okay? There are many definitions given about corruption. I've just taken one of it. Says that there is abuse of authority or position. The position that we have as educators, the position that we have as administrators. In the case of student lecturer engagement, there is that power imbalance. And that is what we see, that is why we say there is always a possibility that we could be swayed by personal interests. Right? So again, abuse of authority or position to benefit financially or in kind. This is an important component as well. In the past, you're thinking only about benefit in terms of gift. How much money you get, how expensive is the gift that has been given to you. But there are also more insidious, more dangerous element of corruption. And these are in kind. Patronage, favoritism, nepotism, for example. For personal or private gain from another individual or group that is expecting to receive a favor or benefit in that exchange. Right? So, if you look at unfair practices in lessons delivery, this is usually a very personal matter because there's a small group of students who you deal with on a daily basis. You do the delivery of the lecture on an individual basis unless you have a teamwork. Let's look at that later on. Right? So there's a lot of objectivity as well as subjectivity involved. Objectivity perhaps in the content, in the course content, how the content should be structured, what should be included in the content, right? The subjectivity is the style of delivery. So you have a situation where sometimes students are not happy with the way the lessons are delivered, right? There could be allegation about not sufficient time is given to certain points. Okay? Lecturers are rushing through the course outline because of public holidays, because of their personal other commitments, right? Research has shown that as far as students are concerned, the more burnt out they are because of the heavy course content, the more likelihood that they will be adopting in attempts to influence the outcome of the assessment. Because they are trying to take shortcuts. They're more willing to engage in corrupt practices to cover up for the fact that they are not able to provide sufficient time and attention to the course that they are dealing with, right? So if you flip the coin and look at us as educators, the commitment that we have to put into the course delivery, it's time-consuming, right? It's time-consuming. So perhaps at the institutional level, we could also consider this as a holistic issue, right? In terms of course assignment, in terms of fairness of teaching hours, in terms of notice that is given for lecturers, in terms of training, okay? Because this could lead to unfair practices in lesson delivery, right? Absenteeism is also an issue, right? I wouldn't want to say that it's rampant. Sometimes we have the assessment metrics to evaluate directors, to evaluate educators' commitment to teaching. My area is corporate law, so sometimes you get mixed up educators and directors, right? Both have certain fiduciary responsibility. That's a separate corporate law discussion. Look at absenteeism, for example. We have the commitment to publish, to do consultation, right? To have community engagement. These are all good. There is a need for us to be able to manage this. the reason why I asked the lecture the sharing session to start at 11:30 was because I had to fulfill my kerja hakiki, 10 to 11, right? So those are the kind of decisions that we have to make on a daily basis, and we're hoping that working together, educators will fulfill their promises, and administrators will also assist in making sure that there is sufficient support for proper delivery and preventing unfair practices. Right? The course material is also rife with opportunity for corrupt behavior. If you send our kids to the secondary, primary school, there's this private tuition, right? In fact, if you look at the report in 2007, there is specific provision dealing with private tuition. On its own, it's not bad. In principle, it is supposed to enable those who may not be, who may be having challenges dealing with a large group, to have private attention, to improve the learning system, to improve the person's ability to incorporate what has been taught in the class in terms of emphasizing lessons. But in some jurisdiction, it has been known that this is rampant in the sense that the teachers are teaching the same students in the school and also as part of the private tuition arrangement. And there is an understanding that these students should go to the private tuition scenario after school, right? So these were highlighted in the UNESCO report. And so in our situation, right, we are required to assist students in terms of providing them with learning materials. Right? I hope there is no such practice of, insisting students buying materials that we have provided. And if that is done on the basis of these are materials which is required to be used, then perhaps we need to find better ways to assist them so that any element of private gain can be minimized, right? So I suppose things like the technology, the learning management system is very useful. Okay. This one is restrictive. Sorry. This one is restrictive. Tak dengar ya. So kita tak ada team untuk support kita punya public appearance. So we played by ear. Perhaps nanti we can have a question answer session. Right. So we're talking about practices in lessons delivery. We have our course outline, that component recommended reading, right? So the trick I use, up to you to assess whether it's corrupt practice or not. The trick I use is, these are recommended readings. You pick up any company law textbook that you find is useful for you. These are the lists. But I am relying on this for the purpose of delivery. Okay? And then you negotiate with the publisher for a better price. So you do what you can. Certain practices are not inherently corrupt practices, but taken out of context, in certain set of circumstances, it could be manipulated, right? For the purpose of obtaining private gains. Right? So great manipulation. Most educators are aware of this, right? There could be requests or pressure, either from the student or perhaps because of patronage, or perhaps because the faculty needs to comply with certain image, right? There could be great manipulation involved. People who are given merit for things which are not due, okay? Award of undue merit. That's the most common example of what we can easily establish as corrupt practices in the education system as part of our role as educators. Excessive gifts and hospitality. A hot issue, right? A hot issue. Let me share with you from my experience at one of the conference, national level on corporate law. So one of the problem with meetings is attendance, right? Shareholders sometimes don't bother to attend. So companies are sometimes required to entice them to attend, to fill up the rows, right? And these are done by way of a door gift. Okay? So then somebody from the audience said that there are reports of some shareholders who's just there for the door gift. The question is, what's the door gift? In fact, there are also anecdotal evidence of shareholders sending their chauffeurs, their mates, to pick up the dog gift and disappear. So the question coming from the audience is, what is the value of this practice? So the panelists on stage said, jokingly, perhaps we just should abolish dog gift, right? So that people can attend really for correct purposes. So what he wanted to do was open up a discussion on how do you encourage shareholders to attend, right? And looking at low-hanging fruits like this may not be the right approach in the long run. But the discussion then turns out into, what's wrong with dog gifts, right? So you have a situation where the focus of attention has shifted from what should have been the value of the discussion into something which is just periphery. So when we talk about excessive gifts, the note is excessive. Gifts and hospitality, sponsorship, for example. These are emerging issues, right? When you talk about student, perhaps you don't really talk about sponsorship. We're probably talking about situations where you have dealings with service providers, okay, at the faculty level. Certain arrangement perhaps to sponsor certain travel trips to attend conferences, right? And so there's uncertainty of whether this is donation given to the faculty or attempt to influence, okay, long-term relationship with the faculty by the sponsors. Perhaps those who wants to, arrange with the faculty about acquisition of materials or so this is what we call hospitality. Fortunately, our ABAC policy, there are also policies which amongst our IIUM community in terms of gift policy. So again, the word here is excessive. And sometimes we underestimate our ability to be objective when it involves our personal interests. Right? We often think that, okay, when we talk about corruption, it's wrong. But when we talk about how do you define corruption, that is challenging because we are often persuaded by our own self-interest. That's why you can't be judge and jury of your own case. So we have to have a certain standard, and that standards provide safeguard for us. The rules are there not to be seen as restrictive. The rule could be seen as providing guidelines because we know that at the end of the day, we are all open to temptation. So the word here is excessive gifts, and that's why most practices will specify a minimum amount above which we have to disclose if you want to accept it. But there is this question, once that we have disclosed it, then it's okay for us to receive it. Then it will not be a bribe? No, that's not necessarily the case. The point is, there should not be any attempt for favors to be exchanged in the way we exercise our power when we are in a position of authority vis-a-vis our students. Right? Okay. Patronage, nepotism, and favoritism. These three things goes together. These are preferential treatment based on connections. It could be family. It could be perhaps in some jurisdictions racial or tribal, right? It could be because of your own religious or political or value system, and there is this kind of favoritism given for people, students having the same value, same belief system, right? There could be that possibility. Patronage is often used in terms of, political patronage. But that's not necessarily the case. There could be situations where a person already high up in terms of position at the university level. may not be influenced by gifts, but is thinking about building a relationship after retirement. And so that patronage is there. The possibility that you could be influenced, not immediately, but in the future. Right? Discriminatory behavior and bias. When we talk about conflict of corruption, we often think about it as conflict of interest. You have your own interests. You are supposed to gain something out of it. But there is also unfair practices in the education, in the delivery of the courses, in the delivery of the services, when we are not aware that we have certain biases, right? Perhaps we have situation where what we call, in some of the profession, they call it anchoring bias. You have dealt with this kind of behavior in the past. And so you think that whenever you have a new scenario, then the reason for that conduct is the same. So you have this anchor there, and the anchoring might be wrong, right? There may be same outcome, but there could be different reasons why the students acted in a certain way. So you are biased in that manner. You're saying, oh, he has failed before. That's why, it's not possible that he's going to fail now, without complying with the assessment method. So these are anchoring bias that we should be aware of. Sextortion. Okay? Instead of bribe, the currency is policy in place to deal with this. Right? Sexual harassment. Sometimes we have statement made by people who are not aware that what they're doing is actually sexual harassment. Alah, gurau je, calling people sayang and things like that. So there should be some ways to deal with this. In some of the reports, they deal with sexual harassment as a specific issue. It may not be rampant, right? But it's there. And this is more difficult to detect. Why? Because unlike a classroom setting, where there's only one and 7 students, like here, it usually involves 1 to 1. More difficult in terms of detection. More difficult. Amongst educators, because of the power position, right? So these are things that we need to be aware of. Manipulating information via leakages of assessment questions, right? It could be intentional, which is worrying, but it could also be unintentional because of negligence. Right? We don't have a good system protecting the information. Sometimes information is provided just left there. There's no security. There's no data. Assessment questions are used, right? Again and again. So these are perhaps because of that workload, right? There's no perhaps proper procedure in place, timeline given in advance, and unintentionally, the lecturer who has too many commitments to perform might be swayed into taking the shortcut. Right? It may be one-off, but the impact is very, very large in terms of the quality of the education, in terms of the credibility of the student that we let, or we allow, or we assist in joining public life. Right? Ignoring students' academic misconduct could also be individual, or it could be a collusion. Okay? We have, for example, a report that one student has been sharing information because of there has been leakage, right? And they've been sharing this on WhatsApp group, for example. And the faculty knows, but decides not to take action. Why? Because then they will have to redo the examination entirely, right? So that's a collusion now, instead of individual basis. Sometimes you have cases like this. Why? Because we do not properly deal with the first point. Right? We're rushing through the course, not able to cover it within some timeline. we misplace the marks that we have given to our students. So we try to cover this up by ignoring students' academic misconduct. It's a tit for tat. Right? The student could say, okay, you have not marked my papers, and we realize you have misplaced the papers. Okay? And so the students say, how do we deal with this? We need to make a complaint. And you're now worried that there's going to be a bad record because of the complaint to ombudsman. Right? So these are things which are evolving. However ethical you are, you're always exposed to this. There's always that possibility of temptation. So the rules are there to perhaps punish those who intentionally, who are unfortunately unethical by nature, ada ke? Unethical by nature, or perhaps people who are persuaded by one-off situation, right? Not knowing that the implication is just not one-off, but going to the future. Okay, next. Do you have time to play the video or we don't? Do you tengok the video? Number 1 and number Korean movie. Those two are obvious cases of sexual abuse. Right? So things like sexual abuse, we all agree, it's bad. Right? But other things which may not be so clear, these are what we say, we need to look at it in context. School of Rock. Where's the corrupt behavior there, if you can call it corrupt? They hired somebody who's not qualified to do the session. Of course, it's a feel-good movie, so at the end, students, yes, right? But it also requires you to think about the recruitment process. That's institutional level. Right? Freedom writers, one of the issues was she wanted to teach students when they go to a higher level. There was very strong resistance from some of the senior lecturers. Rightly so, it's not wrong, because the senior lecturers are saying, you have not been trained to deal with this standard of education level. So there's merit in what the senior professor said. But there's also merit in the lecturer wanting to make sure that the group of students that she has nurtured is able to move to a higher level with the same support. These are in context of the underserved community. Right? So what it brings to mind is that corruption in education, other than most obvious cases of bribes, when you know students are failing, the parents come over and give you a plane ticket. Okay, those are obvious cases. But most of the unethical educational practices, these are more under the radar, because you have to look at it in context. But at our level, there must be some benchmark, right? Like we say, there are some cultural connotations in gift-giving, yes, but there must be a benchmark, right? Next one. Okay, so let's look at what we could do in terms of making sure that whatever policy, the anti-corruption framework that we want to put in place is able to be effectively implemented. Bear in mind the hurdles. So the policy must address the hurdles. We need to identify what is the problem. There is research looking at anti-corruption framework by looking at functionality. Not looking at the practices alone, but looking at why did that practice took place? Okay? What was the reason for that corrupt practice? Not just looking at the corrupt practice. You don't deal only with the symptom, but you deal with the cause of the problem. Okay? So let's look at some of the elements that needs to be put in place. Okay? Obviously, there must be policies, but these policies must be robust. Robust policies and rules that reduces corruption opportunities. Right? So you identify what is the reason why that corrupt behavior could occur, could proliferate. And then you make sure that the rules are there, taking into consideration things like context, right? Things like perhaps culture component. So the research that I shared with you about certain students from certain geographical area, they believe in sharing is caring, collaborative work, and so they produce work that mimics other people of that group, right? As opposed to community with very individualistic behavior. We don't work on a community level, it's us on our own. So you have strong support for practices which doesn't show there's a lot of plagiarism in place in terms of submission of student work, right? So you have to take context, to take note of the cultural context, the timing, the transaction, right? This policy must be able to identify, clarify what are unacceptable behavior. Then there must be disclosure of interest. You know, there's this statement, sunlight is the best disinfectant, Justice Brandeis, for legally trained people. So sunlight is supposed to be the best disinfectant. That means when there is disclosure. Disclosure is not to, in some situations you have two approaches. Disclosure is to make sure you get the consent and you are forgiven. There is no dosa, right? The second is disclosure is for you to evaluate. Are you comfortable with people knowing what you're doing? Okay? And then you have to take note that this disclosure is as a preventive measure. So if you don't want to disclose, then why is it that you do not want to disclose? There must be a reason. Are you comfortable with people knowing this? Right? So again, you have to be careful of the nature of that individual. Right? Like I said, I suppose nobody wakes up in the morning with intention to commit crime, unless that person is a psychopath, right? But the opportunity will always be there. The temptation will always be there. So disclosure is taken as a way to make sure that if you think it is something that you're not comfortable with other people knowing, then that means you shouldn't have done it in the first place. Okay? There will be a lot of disclosure elements in some of the rules. And I suppose for end users, for us, it as a means of saying, okay, I disclose, therefore, up to is put in place. It's supposed to be a self-disciplinary method for you to try to avoid being swayed by temptation. Declaration of income and assets and whatnot, right? We have to have a code of conduct and a code of ethics. In some profession, they have professional code of conduct. In the accounting profession, board of engineers, in some jurisdictions, they have, being a lecturer, being a teacher, you have to be qualified. You have to have certification. Do you want to go to down that path? Right? At the very least, you have to have a code of conduct for that practice. So we have in URA our code of conduct. It may not be tailored to teaching and learning. It's for staff in general. There's value in it, but perhaps we should be looking at more particular example. And I believe the ABAC policy does that in a way. Okay? You have to have curriculum review. There is that objectivity there. You have to have assessment policy and grading metrics. This will reduce unfair grading practices. Right? It's cumbersome. Yeah, it's cumbersome. But the trick is, once you do it as a matter of practice, it becomes instinctive. Right? When you talk about corrupt practices, you have to have an awareness. There must be conscious deliberation of whether you are in that position. And so you're always, in a way, on guard. Right? The assessment policy and grading metrics, when you do this, you have to have it handy. But, I say, in terms of people who have been doing it based on experience and skill, it becomes second nature. And so you need to make it instinctive. Right? Cultivating integrity. This is the most challenging part, because you won't see the outcome within a short span of time. If you look at curriculum review for educators and administrators, right? 4 years, 5 years. You'll only be able to see this later. But we have to start so that there is no normalization of corrupt practices. People in the know, you hear rumors, you hear stories, you shouldn't be saying things like, oh, tak apalah, it's the person's perangai like that, right? These are actually behavior which we are sometimes guilty of, normalizing unethical practices. There must be leadership, modeling of ethical behavior, all the time, right? And when we say leadership, not necessarily leaders, right? In the corporate structure, you say board of directors, not necessarily board of directors. There must be anybody who is in a position of authority, right? Ethical education training. It's the quality, it's not quantity so much. Rely more on role-playing activities. Rely more on facts-based decision-making. Right? You could use School of Rock as an example. You could use Freedom Writers as an example. Evaluate the decision of the person who opposed the appointment of so-called unqualified person to deal with the cause, and person whose intention was to benefit the student. At the end of the day, it's a feel-good movie, so there was benefit. But the evaluation to come to whether or not you want to allow that practice to consider, that is always competency building in pedagogy, training activities about contents, about assessment method. The education faculty will be very happy. Lot of work. Tailored. Integrity pledges. We have during COVID, when students were supposed to do online assessment. After that, we don't see that anymore. Does that mean our students are all automatically full of integrity once there is no COVID? Right? So this should be continued. In a multicultural society, when we deal with international students, when we deal with students with different values, that we could fail because of our own biases. Yep. Next. Okay. Alright. Dia punya animation lari ya. Accountability measures. You talk about quality assurance, you think about KCE. Right? That's not the meaning of quality assurance. Okay, processes must be in place. What is the processes? Does it achieve the purpose? What is the reason? Sometimes we have a situation where the institution is very mature, so all processes are in place. The challenge is the reluctance to change practice, anchoring bias. This is the way we've done things. Why should we change? It's worked in the past. Why should it change? Right? So quality assurance is a tool. It's not an end. Right? Regular audits and evaluation. That means checking mechanism must be in place. Right? So you have the SOP, but like I said, the SOP is there, but you can't be very rigid. Okay? Sometimes you want to meet that process, but the reason is because process cakap macam tu, you have to comply with it, which is not what processes should be. The aim is not following the processes for the sake of following the processes itself. It must be to achieve a better quality of work. Integration of ethical mindset into talent management policies. Okay, we have at our university level APAR. You have to evaluate. The only part that I put there very high 10 marks is in terms of ethics. Right? Other things, when you say leadership quality, I wouldn't put at 10 because I don't think it's at 10. But things about ethics, you should put at 10, unless there is contradictory opinion. I'm more worried about that change instead of teaching 12 jam, right? 10, tiba-tiba your supervisor kata 8. Alamak. That's more worrying. What is it that causes that change? Right? So again, talent management policy, we have this cold storage. Once you've been found convicted of certain disciplinary action, then there is some cold storage timeline, right? Macam penjara ni session, right? So you have situations where, okay, the person has been found guilty or liable for certain bad practices. He has been punished, right? He has reformed. And now you want to promote him in terms of perhaps two things. First, promotion for lecturer, associate professor, right? Sometimes you want to promote him to a position of authority. I think this is a very tricky issue. You appoint somebody who has been found responsible for plagiarism, proven, right? Cold storage has been passed. And then the appointment is to a position of authority as Deputy Dean, Student Affairs, right? Student perhaps that needs to be taken into consideration in terms of position of authority. In terms of his promotion or her promotion as associate professor, that one is based on work put in, so fine. But in terms of position of authority, because like you said, you know, we tend to underestimate our own capability, our own ethical measurement, right? Okay, engagement and reporting channels. It must be safe, it must be transparent, it must be anonymous. We have to have whistleblowing policy in place, right? Sometimes the problem is that people believe that there's nothing which is done when there is corrupt behavior, and is seen to be a normal process. That's the culture part. How do you create an environment where you know saying the wrong things will not result in you being ridiculed? Okay, so the policy must be in place, whistleblowing policy, grievance channels, appeals process, and the administrator involved must uphold the highest standard of privacy. Okay, gag order must always be there. Again, it's a question of mindset. Okay, leverage on technology. We have in the technology sector, we have RegTech, okay, FinTech, and now we have EduTech. Not as a company, right? But in terms of usage of technology in the education process, it does assist in providing standardization. You have to have an appropriate education management information system. Like, for example, you take this in terms of release of teaching materials. Students asking, do we have to photocopy, madam? I said, I'm putting it on the learning management system. Okay, so it's entirely up to you. You can photocopy, but it's accessible. You don't have to buy the document from me. Okay, so that's education management system. What kind of materials you have to put there? Of course, you have to remember there is always that IP, intellectual property rights issue, right? But accessibility to minimize situations where you are seen to be peddling your wares, insisting students to buy this, without which students will fail. Okay, these are some of the practices identified in the 2016 report from UNESCO. You have to have infrastructure to minimize academic fraud. Use technology again. Assessment system, right? Data privacy, your password, right? Data security, and there must also be administrative simplification and automation. Okay, so leverage on technology, primarily on administrator. The educator are implementers. Engagement and reporting channels for the whole university, administrator, educators, plus the student body. In some jurisdiction, there were reports about students being penalized when they make a complaint, right? So how do we make sure that complaints are addressed appropriately and that students are not penalized either in terms of the way they treated Sometimes the grades are okay, but for the students to complete the course because of the highlight, because of them highlighting certain bad practices, they get the results because of their academic excellence. But for them to complete the course, it's so mentally anguishing for them, right? So these are some practices that I think we should sit down and look at it both at the faculty level in terms of provider of the contents and at the administrators level to provide the sufficient technological support, for example. Okay, right, next one. Okay, so promotion. Where do we find this information? That's another issue. Data management must be properly managed. Sometimes we have a lot of information, but this information is with the person, right? So when the person leaves, there's no handover. There's no passing down of that experience, that skill. So the data management system must be appropriate. Sometimes you click, you know where to go to, right? The archiving process is not there. You click, and then it goes to this information. And you think it's the current, it's dated 10 years ago because it's available on the net. So how do we control this? Right? You want to make sure that it is accessible because otherwise it will not be useful. So in terms of the format of how you communicate the information to the end user, that's the formatting, the data management system. In terms of the contents, how should it be stated? Then you rely on perhaps, in some cases, principle-based approach. In some cases, more detailed process and procedure. So you have to have a policy, then you have to have the SOP supporting it. So what we have now is ABAC policy IIUM. I've given you a snapshot of the potentially corrupt opportunities for corruption risk, right? The IIUM gift policy. We have IIUM whistleblowing protection policy. We have IIUM code of ethics. Okay, your IIUM staff disciplinary rules. Okay, so yes, it's scattered. That's why we say once the policy is in place, each KCDIO will need to think about how you pick this information. In terms of procurement, financial policy is there. Perhaps for the faculty, it's not that great an issue because we don't decide at the end of the day. But there is evaluation of technical specification that is kuliah-centric. And so you have to have that in place, right? In terms of procurement, you think of it at a cursory glance, there's no issue in terms of teaching and learning. Apa procurement? Unless talking about teaching materials, right? You want to have system for delivery. You want to have that smart board, right? You want to use iPad, whatnot. Okay, so these are functional. You need to tag it to what is the function that you are using for your particular unit or department or whatnot. Okay, right. So that concludes the sharing session. Perhaps we need to look at it from this perspective. Is it individual first or institutional first? Or is it institutional first or individual first? Does it matter? Right? It must be hand in hand. There are some things that you need to comply with in terms of the low-hanging fruits. You want to see immediate measures, so you put in the policy in place. Right? But it should not matter whether it starts at your individual self, or you rely on the institution to do it, or institution comes up and say everybody has to do it, and you begrudgingly say, okay lah, I have to follow because that's what the rule says. Right? We should be looking looking at a situation where we say, if you are corrupt, you lose out, and that should not be the base. We should avoid that. A situation where we say, if you are corrupt, you lose out. We should be aspiring to a situation where we say, if you are not corrupt, you stand out. Okay? So if the committee says, if you're corrupt, you lose out, that means corruption is endemic. right? It's so rampant, as opposed to a situation where we say, if you are not corrupt, you stand out, right? So that closes the sharing session. I appreciate any comments, any views from the audience. Thank you.
Prof stay. Prof stay. All right. Thank you, Prof Aiman, for your comprehensive. Yes. All right. Okay. Thank you, Prof, for your comprehensive exploration of the topic on the ABMS teaching in learning. So we believe we have a question from the audience in the auditorium. You may come to the mic provided here. If there is any question for Prof to answer. Right, anyone? There is any question on the YouTube? There is any question? Someone can. Yeah?
Perhaps not question lah. Perhaps other views.
Views on the.
Let's engage in some conversation.
So maybe I can ask something lah to you, Prof. Okay.
MC ada soalan.
MC kena ada soalan.
Ini soalan bocor ni.
Soalan bocor. Okay. You already told us about the identifying about the risk of the ABM in teaching and learning, right? The risk of corruption,
In
right?
teaching and learning.
So I would like to asking about the sponsorships in terms of sponsorship. Okay, there is some situation whereby student need to do a program. So with the limits of budgets, somehow students have to find a sponsor to do so that the program will run smoothly lah. For example, it's not about sponsor in terms of money. For example, maybe sponsor on the water, mineral water. So on how student will get the info on this, is that this corruption or or not?
In context.
Yeah. In context. Is that student can do it or not? Even though we as a staff also sometimes have to do a program,
yes,
so we might do something like this. So is that a corruption or how?
Thank you for the question. Soalan popular tu, sponsorship and gifts. We had a discussion about the type of tudung, the type of tudung, the value of it, right? Okay. So take a step back, look at it in context, right? Is it inherently bad? No. Some organizations do have to do this as part of their CSR activities. So we take note of that. What we need to be aware of is what is the policy in place in terms of perhaps disclosure of who it is, evaluation of, I suppose you take mineral water, tak ada masalah lah kot. But if we look at not mineral water, if you look at monetary value, okay, there have been cases where some organizations, perhaps not legit, right, using the corporate structure to launder ill-gotten gains. So when you talk about gifts, sponsorship and donations, in terms of monetary value, that's what we need to be careful. That's what we say at our discussion workshop level, incoming, right? Donation that we either solicit or people approach us and request whether they can donate to meet their own CSR policies or activities. So again, how do we resolve this? What's the reason for this to occur? Perhaps there's not sufficient funds. Perhaps because of ketirisan, right, in how we allocate our funding resources. So that's why when the standard is there, it's transparent, and you follow it, then there is less likelihood of students being accused of personally benefiting from that activity. I don't see a problem sekali lalu, cursory grants of sponsorship from outside parties. But the problem is that sponsorship tagged to something, right? If the institution is considering dealing with certain vendors, the vendors is part of the bidding system. 6 vendors come in. Then one of them sponsors. Do you think that will influence the outcome? Of course, you say no. You say no, because you want to justify accepting, right? But there is a conflict of interest there. So certain situations, like the sponsorship is given during a time when there is bidding process in place, that should be outrightly prohibited. Don't look at whether, it's beneficial, otherwise a student program, then you find some other source of funding. Because the worry is this could influence the objectivity of that other system. Remember, the definition is exchange. Is there possibility of that exchange taking place? Right? So perhaps I can't answer that as in relation to specific, right? So perhaps SIC will come in, Staff Investigation Committee will come in, investigation audit. But the understanding is there another situation where this sponsorship could be used as a barter, as an exchange currency of exchange? Okay.
All right, thank you, Prof. It's come out on my mind actually. Is that can possible if we try to again the sponsorship, but you worried about there is maybe an exchange on that, but if there is can we do somehow like there is some form or any disclaimer, right? When you give us the sponsorship, there will no in advance any advantage for this cost.
You can use that disclosure form, but sometimes the way the disclosure form is worded, it doesn't make sense. Do you think somebody will say, "Oh, I will not"? Right. That's why when you say about disclosure, you have to disclose what relationship you have, not whether you have intention or not, because evaluation of your intention doesn't work on the paper. So you use other, in academic research, we say other proxy. And the proxy is for perhaps family relationship. Proxy is perhaps any other transaction you are now in negotiation with different, right? So I can understand why sometimes the people who are involved in audit, okay, they will not look kindly upon sponsorship, right? But you have to balance it with perhaps operational need. So there are some other measures that should be put in place. That's why we say you don't look at it on its own. There has to be some connection with other things that you could use as proxy that could be seen as influencing the decision maker. So kalau kita tengok example, the sponsor is I'm not sure whether this could happen lah, but just for the sake of argument, right? Hypothetical. Lecturer kan suka buat hypothetical question. So you have a case where there's a bid. The sponsor, the majority shareholder is the father of one of the students, right? And the student is in critical condition academically, right? Extension beyond normal study period. You guys familiar with it, right? So how do we evaluate this? Right? Of course, the one making the decision, if he's not aware of it, then fine. That's why we say we ask you to disclose whether or not you have pending whatever involving the organization. So the one making the decision has no way of finding this out unless he himself is also involved in the cover-up. We don't expect our educators or our administrator to become private investigator. That's not possible. So you have to have some benchmark. Disclosure is there. But like I said, what is it that you want to disclose? If you say, disclose that you have no intention, they will always say yes. Right? Some of the, I'm always relying on my company law course. One of the issue is evaluate whether director's decision is in the company's interest. So I asked my student, how do you find out whether their conduct is in the best interest of the company? If you ask them, have you acted in the company's interest? What do you think they will answer? Yes. So the kind of question you ask, the kind of information you want to extract is also important. Right? For this, perhaps, Ola dah balik dah pula. The Office of Legal Advisor need to be involved. Right? You can't rely on marketing people alone, because promotional materials sometimes unwittingly ignores the legal consequences, the possibility that conflict could occur. Some of the practices that we need to be aware of.
Thank you, Prof. How about in terms on grading marks or for examination? Somehow, maybe the students maybe low in the academic, but she or he can become a favoritism to the lecturer.
Yalah, itulah.
So,
Itulah isu sekarang. How do you minimize this? First of all, muhasabah diri kena ada. At the end of the day, nanti you kena answer to the person upstairs, not the rector, the person upstairs. So that muhasabah diri, are you sure that you are able to meet your ethical obligation? So you have the standards to assist you to be objective. Sometimes you think you're objective, but you're not. Sometimes the way you interact with the students, okay, kalau students do, sometimes you raise voice to them, once some of the students know that there's no personal, personal intention. No, it's not personal, right? It's just the lecturer saying that these are the things that you shouldn't be doing. It's just that the student is the one who's doing it, and so he or she highlights that. Some students take it personally, right? So these things cannot be decided based on rule of law. It's where consultation, ombudsman comes in, right? But in terms of this assessment, okay? So are we, at the faculty level, are we being pressured to make sure that all our students graduate on time? It's not a question that I want answered. Nanti you guys kena menjawab. But is this, right? So when we say graduate on time, what is the reason for it? Because a lot of the students are being subsidized. So we don't want public money to be spent unnecessarily. Some of the students are not financially capable to complete additional, they have PTPTN, right? So the point is, we want to make sure that students are able to grad. But then we tell the students, you want to grad with a 2.0 or do you want to grad with a 2.5? Which do you think would be helpful to you in terms of being competitive in the workforce? Okay? So with that, what do we do to assist them? But you have to remember, there's only so much you can do, right? There's only so much you can do. So you have to have a mentoring system in place, academic advisor, kat faculty I lah tu. Add and drop tu beratur students to extend study. Sometimes some of them come over and I ask them, what do you want? Saya nak extend madam. Oh fine, senang cerita. There are problems when the students with 2.5 are nak grad juga madam, with 10 credit, 10 subjects. Right? So that's a lot of pujukan. Kadang-kadang pitching I lari juga, tapi macam itulah. Right? So that's a policy. It's not a bad policy, it's good because of the fact that it's public university, public funds are involved. But we can't be, just pushing them through for the sake of pushing them through. And we have to tell our students, we never promise that you will graduate on time. We will assist you, but assisting doesn't mean we give you undue marks. It's graduating on time. Doesn't say you have to graduate only when you get 3.5. Right? So students have to take responsibility for this. Some students come in and say, oh, study plan is 4 years, so you have to graduate on time with 2.5, right? So those are the things that we need to do. There are cases, right? Sometimes, you see, we have this student assessment of our work, kan? And these are done before the end of the semester. So sometimes we have situations where the students grade the lecturer very, very high. Because the lecturer is supposed to be sympathetic, grading. Out of a camp of 60, the student, half the class got 55. Okay, so how do we make sure that these are not inflationary or deflationary grading? Well, what is the system in place? I'm not sure about other faculties. I'm sure there is some, right? I'm speaking from the perspective of the law faculty. You have the moderation session, you have the BOE session, you have to submit on time, the head of department is required to go through, see whether it's inflationary or deflationary, call up. These are things that should be done, but sometimes it's not done. Okay, sometimes it's not done. That's why we say it's an ongoing process. It's hard work, right? Administrator who was in place before, if they have put in place a good system, people come in may not intentionally try to erode it, but maybe unintentionally, because of different priorities, because of different commitment, right? So I hope that shed some light
Yeah.
on the question. Sampai pukul 2 ni ke?
All right, thank you, Prof. So, any question from the audience in the auditorium? If not, we will close our session today. All right, Prof. Okay, thank you, Prof.
I hope that has been helpful. I'm not saying that this is the only way of doing it. It's not me saying it's my way, right? No way, or it's no way unless it's my way. No, but these are practices. So I suppose there should be some sharing experience. Maybe dean to dean level, academic deputy dean, academic advisor level. That constant conversation should be carried out. Right? Of course, remember, be mindful of your students' privacy. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Prof. Okay. Thank you, Prof, for the explanation and also the answer for some question. So we extend our sincere gratitude to Prof. Dr. Aiman Nariman for sharing her invaluable insight and experience. We highly appreciate this opportunity to enhance our knowledge and promote good governance, integrity and values within IIUM. So before I end this session, I would like to remind to all participants here to scan QR code for your attendance and also evaluation form. Therefore, we thank all participants in this program, which will conclude with Tasbih Kafarah and Surah Al-As. So before we dismiss, can we took some photo for history for today? All right, somehow can come. Maybe we can go out.
Kat luar.